It was so frustrating. Just when you are ready to give, you feel the compelling urge to hoard, along with hard-to-describe sensations in your arms and hands that keep you from being able to let go. It's called closed fist syndrome, or CFS. Closed fist syndrome is the overwhelming urge to hold on to cash at all costs. This can lead to some very difficult situations, making normal, daily events a major obstacle. CFS can turn a bad situation into a nightmare.
License and registration, please.
My doctor said CFS is a recognized medical condition, and then he said something else. Generous. He said generous would help relieve those CFS symptoms that keep me from giving. He told me what to watch for, that generous may cause you to give more money away than is financially responsible, or to prematurely cash in your 401k. Tell your doctor if you experience these problems. Do not mix alcohol with generous, or you will lose the shirt off your back. Side effects can include bankruptcy, foreclosure, and living in a van down by the river. Most participants were not bothered enough to stop taking generous. Ask your doctor if generous can help you overcome CFS and get you giving again.
All right. So how many of you suffer from CFS? Okay. Let me ask you another question. How many of you like money? Anybody like money? I do. I do. Let me see if I can get this thing figured out here first. Hold on a second. I'll get it. There we go. All right. Get that thing stowed away. Dang nabbit. I may need help here. I don't know. Okay, I got it. All right, cool. Man, that was quite a hassle, I'm telling you. You know, and how many of you would say that at least some point in time in your life you've had more month at the end of the money than what you had, right? Yeah. Anybody ever experienced that where you just run out right when you don't need to? I know what you mean. It's one of those things we all kind of struggle with. You know, I would say that if you don't like money, you're going to be in trouble because, you know, it takes money to be able to live on. If you don't have any money, you're in trouble because you ain't going to be living very well. Let me just welcome you to week number 1 of our new series called Tithe Phobia. And, you know, it's one of those subjects that I haven't talked about in at least 5 years. I just don't do that. I mean, I haven't done that in a long time. So it's been at least 5 years since I've talked about this subject. But what you need to know is that you got to know I'm not afraid to talk about money. That's not the issue. It's not that I'm afraid I'm going to make somebody mad if I do talk about money. It's not those kind of things. But, you know, the simple fact is that from the very beginning of GraceLife.tv, which is, well, I don't know how many years ago now, but, you know, we began this ministry, this church, with a decided idea, with a decided option of, you know, just letting God worry about our finances. We took the decided position to not coerce anybody or beg anybody or try to force anybody into giving. If you don't want to give, you know, that's okay because it's God that needs to speak to your heart and to your life about those things. So that's what we've chosen to do, and we've been doing that for many, many years now. Is just allowing the Holy Spirit to work in your heart and life, and if He moves in your spirit, we just trust that He would move in your spirit to give whatever you feel like is what you can give to help to support and to grow this important ministry here. So let me just say then that the reason I'm talking about money in this series is not because our finances are in the toilet, which they are, quite honestly. But that's not the reason why. If that were the reason why, I'd have done it a long, long time ago, quite honestly. But the reason I'm doing it is because I'm looking forward to showing you some things in God's Word that are really interesting about money and about tithing and all those different kind of things. Some really cool stuff, some really important stuff, some stuff that I've discovered along the way that probably will not only surprise you, because some of the stuff I've been finding has been surprising to me. You know, I've studied this subject in many times before, but it seems like I still am discovering some new and exciting and important and strange things about this entire subject. So I think there's going to be things that not only surprise you, but also will free you from the bondage we often find ourselves in when it comes to talking about money or tithing or the church or all those different kind of things. As a matter of fact, in John chapter 8 and verse 32, Jesus said, you'll know the truth and the truth will make you free, right? Well, a lot of us are in bondage to what we think the Bible has to say about giving, about tithing, about all those different kind of things, right? So if we know what the Bible says, then I think we'll find ourselves being freed to do whatever it is that God has put upon our hearts and our lives. So probably every one of us here today, as well as hundreds of those of you are viewing us online as well. We've got lots and lots of people viewing us online all over the United States as well as around the world in a lot of different places. You've probably all asked yourselves questions like this, like I have, in the past. Am I giving enough? Or how much does God expect me to give? Or, what if I can't give? Will God get it out of my hide some other way? Those kind of things. Or will God just withdraw His blessings from my life? Those kind of things. So if you've ever asked yourself questions like that, then I would say that I think you've probably already missed the point, as I did for many, many years. If you've asked yourself questions like that, I think you've probably already missed the point about what it is that money is about, what it has to do with our ministry and with God, our relationship with God and all those different kind of things. As a matter of fact, I think that most often the questions that we ask about tithing, about giving money, about all those different, that whole subject, has little or nothing to do with the purpose and the design that God has put in place for the support of this ministry. In other words, most of us, if not all of us, have often asked our questions about giving, that those questions we ask come from the fact that we bring with us a lot of baggage, a lot of religious baggage, quite honestly, that's why we ask those kinds of questions. It's because we've been taught some really bad things, some really awful stuff about giving, about money, about all those different kind of things. And specifically, that comes from our misunderstanding of who God is, what God is like, and even what God expects of us, right? We bring that baggage with us, and we want to interject it into everything else that we think that we know about God. So we bring with us a bunch of preconceived ideas about what we think God wants us to do in relation to giving, meaning that a lot of the questions that we ask about giving, about money in general, do nothing more than bring us to, sets us up for a lot of argumentative suppositions, and that automatically draws toward a very legalistic kinds of conclusions and false conclusions about money and those kinds of things. So let me just say right up front, as we begin this series and as we begin today, that by the time we're done here today, you probably won't have any concrete answers to this whole idea about giving, right? You probably won't have any concrete answers because about many of the questions that you have. Because all I wanted to do today is kind of simply lay some groundwork for some stuff we'll be talking about in the next few weeks. We're just going to take a really honest look. Today we're just going to take a really honest look at what God's plan and God's purpose is and those kind of things. So what I want to do is examine some of the most common questions that people have about giving today, and I just want to look at them at face value, not from a biblical standpoint, but from a religious standpoint. And I think there's a huge difference. I hate the word religion, and I use it in a very, I guess I'll just say it straight out. I use it in a derogatory sense, because I think I've told you before that the word religion comes from a basic word that simply means to bind or to tie up. And that's exactly what religion does. There's religion out there. Everywhere you go, there's religion that binds you, that ties you up, that forces you into doing things that you would never do otherwise, and bringing a lot of bondage within your life, that you think you're supposed to do such and such or this and that, especially when it comes to money. So I'm going to look at some of those questions today. We're going to begin looking at some of those questions today because one of the words that has become synonymous with giving is what? Tithing. Exactly. You already know that, right? It's become synonymous with giving. So let's check this word out then and see where we're at. Basically, all churches and denominations and religions today, basically all believe and teach that 10% is God's plan. That's the tithe, right? Or God's standard for giving. In other words, the most popular belief about giving our money to the church is that 10% tithe, quote unquote, is the minimum that God requires that every true believer give to Him. True? Anywhere you go, everywhere you go, they always tell you the tithe is the minimum that God requires every believer to give to Him. In other words, if you're not giving 10% of your money to God, you're not only out of fellowship with God, that's what religion tells us. If you're not giving 10%, then you're not only out of fellowship with God, but God cannot and or will not bless your life. True? That's what religion tells us. It's not true, but that's what religion says. Religion always wants to put the monkey on our back and try to force us into giving 10% of our money to God. And if you don't, they tell us that, well, you're out of fellowship with God. God won't bless your life. That's why you're poor. That's why you don't have any money. All those different kind of things. So the opposite of that would mean is that, well, if you give 10%, then God will give it back to you. Well, that's not true either, quite honestly. So where does this 10% thing come from? Where did the idea of the tithe originate? That word tithe. And I use that loosely, I guess. Actually, the fact is most teachers and preachers and theologians and all those kind of people begin in Genesis chapter 14 where the Bible talks about Abraham giving a tenth of all his spoils to a man by the name of Melchizedek, which were actually the spoils of war is what he was giving to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek in the Bible is a type of Christ. So look at it. This is where most people begin when they talk about the support of the idea that we're supposed to give 10% to God. So let's take an honest look at it, okay? That's what I want to do. I want to say, is that true or is that not true? Okay? And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abraham, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He gave him a tenth of all." That's where most people begin. That's where most preachers, theologians, Bible teachers, whatever, begin there, and they say, this is where the Bible teaches that we're supposed to give 10% to God. However, since this happened before the law was given, in other words, this particular incident, since this particular incident happened before the Ten Commandments were given to Moses, before God handed down all those laws, rules, regulations, all that kind of stuff, that we look at, that most of us want, really shy away from as far as the Old Testament is concerned, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. Since that happened before that time, then most preachers, teachers, theologians, Bible teachers, whatever, choose to assume that God must have given the law about tithing to Abraham long before Moses actually received it from God directly. Okay, there's an assumption made there. A false assumption, but an assumption. That because it says it here, then God must have at some point in time said so, made it a commandment, way back beginning of time. It just didn't get recorded. That's the assumption. That's the idea, is that that's what happened. Not only that, but this same incident then is referred to again in Hebrews chapter 7, which seems to add greater credence to the idea that 10% is what you're supposed to give. In other words, a lot of people say, well, it happened in the Old Testament, it's reiterated in the New Testament, therefore it's reconfirmed that that's what you're supposed to do, is to give a tithe, 10% of your money as a minimum to God. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 7 then. It says, now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of his choicest spoils. Who was that? Melchizedek, right? Observe how great this man was, okay? And so to speak, right? Let's take an honest look. Let's see what it says. And so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes and paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Okay, that may seem a little confusing at first, but all it's saying really there is that at the time that Abraham paid tithes, gave Melchizedek 10%, he had in effect, Levi had in effect already paid tithes through Abraham. Levi was born at some later time. Abraham was his long gone relative, right? Long dead relative. So my question is, what does that have to do with paying the tithe? Is that saying Levi, now who is born many years later, in essence, already paid tithe to Abraham, to Melchizedek, through his long dead father Abraham? Got it? Does that make any sense? Okay. So what does that have to do with being required to pay a tithe? Nothing. Thank you. Absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, if you choose to believe that giving your money to God is the subject matter of Hebrews chapter 7, which it is not, then the point would actually be about being able to trace your lineage back to Abraham, so that you could prove that you had already paid tithes through Abraham to Melchizedek. I think I'm going to subscribe to Ancestry.com. Maybe I can trace my ancestry back to Abraham and prove I already paid tithes, so I don't owe no more. That's really what that says, if that's the line of thinking you want to take. However, what you need to know about this whole Melchizedek thing is that Hebrews chapter 7 is simply talking about who Jesus is, not tithing. That's not even the subject matter. It's a declaration of the preeminence of Christ, that Jesus is our great high priest, and that he is a priest forever. It's not a lesson on tithing. Hebrews chapter 7 has nothing to do with tithing. It was just making a point and saying Jesus is the great high priest. That's what it's about. So in other words, in order to try to make a case for tithing based on Genesis 14 and or Hebrews chapter 7 is really to totally disregard what God is actually trying to tell us here, as well as muddling up the true principle of giving, what God really talks about when he talks about giving. Okay, so in addition to all that, was that clear? Okay, good. So in addition to all that, many support the idea that the tithe is God's plan for giving simply because of the percentage rule. Anybody ever been taught that? I was. The percentage rule meaning that 10% for you is the same as 10% for me. It's equality. It's ultimate equality, right? That's the idea. I was taught that. I probably even preached that at some point in time before I came to understand what Big G Grace is all about. Back when I was pastored in a denominational legalistic church. In other words, the rationale goes something like this. It doesn't matter whether you make $100 or $100,000. 10% for you is the same as 10% for me, right? The 10% is still 10%, supposedly meaning that no one pays more than the next guy. Well, however, I see a really serious problem with that whole idea. Do you? I hope so. If you're being honest with yourself, you're going to see a pretty serious problem there. Because if you only make $100 a month, period, I mean, that's all you make, then 10% of that amount could literally mean the difference between eating or going on a forced fast for several days a week out of the month, right? On the other hand, if you make $100,000, well, you know what? Feeding your family on the other $90,000 ain't such a big deal. True? So 10% really isn't what I would call equality. I think my mustache is getting in the way. I don't see that as being equality because, you know what? Well, as I just said, you make $100,000, $90,000 isn't too hard to live on, but $90 is. So there's not really the equality there that we like to think that there is. So 10% might be equality in the strictest sense of the word, but you know what? Where's the grace in that? That's just simply saying, here's the requirement, do it. I don't care if you like it or not. That's what God says, do it. Right? And then if you're really poor and you only make $100 a month, the preacher then will tell you, okay, well just give your 10%, even if you can't afford it, and God will give it back to you. No comment. Except that I'm going to call a big BS on that one. Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a little bit and see how this whole tithe commitment thing works out, right? Let's assume for a moment that 10% is God's plan or God's standard for giving. The next question I'd have to ask them is, and I told you as we began, that once we start down that trail, it brings up more questions than answers, more argumentative supposition than it does anything else, right? So the next question I'd like to ask is, if you choose to believe that 10% is God's standard, it's the minimum that everybody ought to pay to God, that's what we owe to God, that's what's due to God, then I'd have to ask you, well, 10% of what? And I know and everybody's got their own idea, about that as well. Every preacher you talk to's got their whole idea about what that is as well. What 10% of your take-home pay, or after, or 10% after taxes and after you pay your health insurance and life insurance and union dues and all that kind of stuff. So is it 10% of what's left over, or do you pay after all the bills and the family's fed and you put gas in the car? Which 10% is it, right? Well, I'll tell you what, any good preacher, and I'm not a good preacher, so I'm not going to say that, but any good preacher is going to tell you that when it comes to paying your tithe, God expects you to give 10% of your gross. Simple as that. It's 10% off the top goes to God first. I was taught that all my life in the denomination I was raised in. It's off the top. You give God 10% first, and then whatever's left over, you can live off of that. That's what God expects of you, so you just need to do it, and then God will bless your life, and God will take care of that. He'll stretch the bills, all those different kind of things. That's the idea. Well, okay. All right. Let's look at that then. If you want to say that it's 10% of the gross, right? 10% of everything that you make. Okay, I got a few questions to ask you there as well, if that's what you want to believe, that's what you choose to believe. Did you pay 10%, did you tithe on the amount that you saved from that really great car deal you got from the dealership last week? How about, did you pay 10% on that $20 bill you found laying on the sidewalk? Did you do that? That was a nice little windfall. Hey, God gave it to you, right? You ought to at least pay him 10% of that if he's going to give you a $20 bill right out of the. Did you do that, right? And last week when you went to Wally World, and you got all those things on sale and you saved all that money, did you pay God 10% of all the stuff that you saved and that you wouldn't have had to spend otherwise? You understand what I'm saying? It just gets ridiculous, right? If you want to take the hard line and say that God requires us to give 10%, which he doesn't, has absolutely nothing to do with it. I'm going to tell you right up front. But if you want to take that line of thinking, that it just raises more questions and more argument and more suppositions and all that kind of stuff, you know, all those kind of things, and then it just boils down to, well, listen, just give God 10% or else, and otherwise God won't bless your life. Well, let's talk about the real answers, dude. You know, let's ask the hard questions here. Let's take this thing to its logical conclusion and see what we come out with. Well, we just did that, and we find that can't be right. Right? That's not where it's at. You know, I can just see God up there with his, you know, his little green visor over his forehead and his, you know, yeah. And he's keeping account, buddy. That $20 bill you found? Mm-hmm. Yep. You know, he's that great IRS agent in the sky. That's who God is. By the way, have you ever thought about the fact that when you put the and IRS together, it spells theirs? I don't think I like that. Yeah, that's not so good, but it seems to be what it is, isn't it? Wow. And this is tax time, too. Oh, my God. Okay, so if that's not enough, if you're not already just going, well, here's another problem that with this whole tithing idea. Is God only talking about money? When if you decide that 10% is what God requires, is he only talking about money, or is it possible that he's also including things like your time and your talents, right? Maybe well, money's one thing, but you got a lot of talent there. Maybe you ought to give 10% of your talent to God. You know? And what about your time? How much time you spend sitting in front of the TV? You ought to be out there banging on doors, witnessing for Jesus. Okay, so I'm going to quit there, because hopefully you're beginning to realize that taking the tithe commitment idea to its logical conclusion actually creates more questions than it does answers. If you choose to believe that 10%, the tithe, is what God requires of you, man, I'll tell you what, talk about bondage. Nothing but bondage. And Jesus said, you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. That don't sound like much freedom to me. I've lived there. I was raised as a preacher's kid. I was required to give 10% of my allowance to God every Sunday. I was required to shine my shoes and put on a suit and a tie and the cufflinks and the whole works, you know. I was required to study my Sunday school lesson on Saturday evening before you go to church on Sunday. All those things that you owe to God, right? I know what I'm talking about. I've been there. I've done that. And a lot of you have as well. And even if you haven't, I think you can see that there are so many difficulties that come from the requirements that religion imposes upon us. Religion imposes upon us, not God. It's not even in the Bible. It's not even there. And we're going to be talking about that. So here's the point. Here's what I want you to leave you with today. Even though there's been I'll talk about a load of that green stuff, that manure, that's the French word. You know what it means. The Bible makes it very clear. The tithe is neither a commandment which must be kept in order to be right with God, nor is the lack of tithing, by definition, necessarily a distinguishing characteristic of an unhealthy relationship with Jesus Christ. Neither is true. Neither is it a commandment that must be kept, nor if you don't keep the commandment, does that mean that your life is not on track with God and God will not bless your life and all those different kind of things. So, in other words, I'm just going to say it like this. Whether you give or don't give, that's not the point. That's not the point. We're focusing on the wrong thing, like usual. And debating the amount that we're supposed to give will bring us no closer to the real issue than whether we give or don't give. I mean, you know, it's all just a bunch of BS. So the fact is, here's what Jesus said about giving. Here's what Jesus said about giving. He simply said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That's what he said. You know what? If my right hand knows what my left hand is doing, my right hand says, oh, wait a minute. We could use that somewhere else, right? It's a hard issue. It's a hard issue. So when he says, when you give, just give out of your heart. Doesn't matter the amount. That's not the point. As a matter of fact, in a few weeks we're going to be talking about the widow's mite. Remember that story? Where the widow gave 2 pennies while the rich people were giving all this money. All those things that we tie up together there and say, well, God really wants to bless your life as long as you'll give Him everything I disagree. That's not even what that says. Jesus simply says, and the Bible simply tells us, whatever you purpose in your heart to give that to God. And don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing, because you know what? You stop and think about it, you're going to talk yourself out of it. We all know that there is blessing in giving, whether it's giving to God, to the church, to our neighbor, to our loved ones, to our family. We all know, you know, there's real blessing in that. And God certainly wants us to be blessed. So don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Don't get stuck on the tithe either, because it's not even there. More questions than answers. You know what? God's awesome. And all the stuff that we tie up in this whole tithing thing brings God from here down to, you know, somewhere down there, because we begin to fear Him instead of wanting to be with Him. And obviously when that happens, there's a real problem. I'm going to tell you, just don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. If you want to give, give. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give whatever you decide to give in your heart. Because what you're giving to is to see this ministry continue, quite simply. If this ministry has been a blessing to your heart and your life, do that. Do that. God's awesome. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is His name. Lord bless you all. Amen.